5 years after being branded a murderer for his wife's mysterious disappearance, she suddenly reappears at his door with a scarred face and a rusted box that proves his entire life was a lie. Now the architect of his own ruin must decide if he's reuniting with the woman he loves or the person who was sent to destroy him. They say grief is a hole in the ground that you eventually learn to walk around, but for me, grief was a landslide. It didn't just leave a hole. It buried everything I had ever built, everyone I had ever loved, and the man I used to be. For 5 years, I lived in the suffocating dirt of that landslide, breathing through a straw, waiting for the weight to finally crush my ribs. My name is Elias, and 5 years ago, I was a man who had won the cosmic lottery. I was 32, a junior partner at a prestigious architectural firm in Chicago, and I was married to Elena. To describe Elena is to try and describe the sun without using the word bright. She was a whirlwind of copper hair, sharp wit, and a laugh that could make a funeral feel like a celebration. We had been married for 3 years, and our life was a series of perfects. Perfect brownstone in Lincoln Park, perfect weekend trips to the coast, a perfect future planned out in sketches and blueprints. Then came the night of October 14th. I remember the weather most of all, a cold, biting rain that turned the city streets into mirrors of black ink. I had stayed late at the office finishing the renderings for the Lakeshore project. I'd called Elena at 6 p.m. to tell her I'd be home by 8. She told me she was making her famous mushroom risotto and that she had a surprise for me. Her voice sounded light, melodic. There wasn't a hint of fear, not a tremor of hesitation. When I walked through the front door at 8:15 p.m., the house was silent. The lights were on. The table was set for 2. The smell of burnt rice hung heavy in the air, a bitter charcoal scent that didn't belong in our home. I found the risotto charred to the bottom of the pot on the stove, the flame still flickering underneath it. Her wine glass sat on the counter, half full, a faint smudge of her peach-colored lipstick on the rim. Her phone was sitting right next to it. Her keys were in the bowl by the door. Her coat was on the hook. Elena was gone. The first hour was confusion. The second hour was panic. By the third hour, the police were in my living room, and the landslide had begun its first shift. You see, in the movies, when a wife disappears, the husband is the hero who stops at nothing to find her. In reality, the husband is the prime suspect. I didn't know it then, but from the moment Detective Miller stepped into my kitchen and saw that burnt risotto, he wasn't looking for a missing person. He was looking for a body. "Where's the struggle, Elias?" Miller had asked me, his eyes roaming my pristine living room. No broken glass, no forced entry, just a woman who evaporates into thin air while cooking dinner. That sounds like she knew her attacker, or it sounds like someone cleaned up. Within 48 hours, my life became a true crime documentary. The media picked up the story with a ravenous hunger. "The architect's secret," the headlines screamed. They dug into everything. They found a heated argument we'd had at a gallery opening 3 months prior. They interviewed a disgruntled former intern who claimed I had a volatile temper. They scrutinized our finances and found a life insurance policy I'd forgotten we'd even signed during our mortgage application. I was never charged. There was no body, no weapon, and no forensic evidence of a crime. But I was convicted in the court of public opinion. My partners at the firm suggested I take an indefinite leave of absence. My friends, the people who had toasted at our wedding, stopped calling. My own mother looked at me with a flicker of doubt in her eyes that broke my heart more than any headline ever could. I spent every cent of my savings on private investigators who found nothing. I sold the brownstone because I couldn't stand the silence of the kitchen. I sold the car. I moved into a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city where no one knew my name. But even there, the ghosts followed. I took a job drafting basic HVAC layouts for a construction company, a far cry from the glass towers I used to dream of. I became a shadow. I stopped looking at the missing posters I'd plastered across the state. I stopped checking the news for Jane Does. I just existed. A man whose life had been frozen in time on October 14th. 5 years, 1,825 days of silence. Until last night. It was raining again. That same biting Chicago rain. I was sitting in my armchair, the springs poking into my back, nursing a cheap whiskey and watching the droplets race down the window pane. My buzzer rang. It was 11:30 p.m. I didn't get visitors. My heart did a slow, painful roll in my chest. I thought it might be the landlord or perhaps a drunk neighbor. I walked to the intercom, my hand trembling slightly. "Who is it?" I asked, my voice raspy from disuse. There was no answer, just the static of the old speaker and the sound of heavy breathing. "Who is it?" I repeated, louder this time. "Elias?" The voice was a whisper, cracked and hollow, but I would have recognized it in the middle of a hurricane. It was the voice that had haunted every dream and every nightmare for 5 years. It was the voice of the woman I had buried in my mind. I didn't think. I threw the locks back and tore the door open. The hallway was dimly lit, the yellow bulb flickering overhead. Standing there, soaked to the bone, her hair matted and her face gaunt, was Elena. She looked older, much older than 37. There were lines around her eyes that shouldn't have been there, and a jagged white scar ran from her temple down to her jawline. She was wearing a coat that was 3 sizes too big for her, stained with salt and grime. I couldn't speak. My lungs felt like they had turned to stone. I reached out a hand, half expecting it to pass right through her, but when my fingers touched the damp wool of her sleeve, she flinched. "Elena?" I finally managed to choke out. Is it really you?" She looked up at me, and for a second, I saw the woman I used to love. But then her eyes shifted, filled with a terrifying, shimmering desperation. She didn't hug me. She didn't cry out in relief. Instead, she reached into the oversized pocket of her coat and pulled out a heavy, rusted metal box. "I didn't leave because I wanted to, Elias," she whispered, her voice trembling so hard her teeth chattered. "I left because they told me they'd kill you if I stayed. But I found it. I found the proof." Before I could ask who they were or where she had been for 5 years, she shoved the box into my arms. It was surprisingly heavy, and it smelled of damp earth and something metallic, like old blood. "We don't have much time," she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder at the empty hallway. "They followed me. I saw the black sedan at the corner. Elias, listen to me very carefully. Whatever you do, do not open that box until I'm gone, and do not trust the police." "Elena, what are you talking about? Come inside, you're freezing." I reached for her arm, but she backed away into the shadows of the stairwell. Her eyes were wide, darting toward the front door of the apartment building. "I came back to give you your life back," she said, a single tear finally breaking through and carving a path through the dirt on her cheek. "But I think I just brought the end of it to your doorstep." Just as I stepped forward to grab her, the sound of a heavy car door slamming echoed from the street outside, followed by the rapid thud of boots hitting the pavement. Elena's face went deathly pale. She didn't say goodbye. She turned and sprinted down the back service stairs, vanishing into the darkness just as the heavy front door of the building was kicked open with a violent crash. I stood in the hallway holding the rusted box as 3 men in tactical gear, their faces obscured by black masks, rounded the corner with their weapons drawn. One of them pointed a red laser dot directly at the center of my chest. "Drop the box, Elias," a muffled voice commanded. "Drop it now or we finish what we started 5 years ago." The red laser dot was a burning needle on my skin, right over my heart. My knees felt weak, the weight of the rusted box pulling me toward the floor, but the adrenaline overrode the terror. 5 years of being a pariah, of being the man who got away with it, had turned my fear into a cold, hard knot of survival instinct. "I said drop it!" the lead man barked. His voice was distorted by a comms mask, sounding like gravel grinding in a blender. I didn't drop it. I did the only thing a man who has already lost everything can do. I gambled. I took a half step back into the frame of my apartment door and slammed it with every ounce of strength I had left. The wood groaned, and I heard the dull thud of a boot hitting the other side a millisecond later. I didn't wait for the hinges to give. I turned and sprinted through my tiny living room. The rusted box clutched to my chest like a newborn child. The first shot didn't sound like a gunshot. It was a suppressed hiss pop, followed by the shattering of my kitchen window. Glass sprayed across the linoleum like diamonds in the dark. They weren't using standard police issue. These weren't cops. I didn't go for the front door. I knew they'd be through it in seconds. I headed for the bathroom, the smallest room in the apartment, and the only one with a window leading to the narrow, rusted fire escape that overlooked the trash-strewn alleyway. I scrambled over the porcelain rim of the tub, shoved the window up, and tumbled out into the freezing Chicago rain. The iron grate of the fire escape groaned under my weight. Below me, the alley was a dark gullet of shadows. Above, I heard my front door splintering open. "He's on the back!" someone yelled. I didn't climb down. I knew they'd be waiting at the bottom. Instead, I climbed up. My hands were raw, the cold metal biting into my palms, but I moved with a frantic, desperate speed I hadn't possessed in years. I reached the roof just as a flashlight beam swept the fire escape below me. I stayed low, crawling across the tar paper surface, the box scraping against the grit. I reached the edge of the roof, looking down at the street below. The black sedan Elena had mentioned was there, idling at the curb, its headlights cutting through the rain like the eyes of a predator. Two men stood by the trunk, their silhouettes sharp and clinical. I crawled toward the neighboring building, a derelict warehouse that had been slated for demolition for 3 years. There was a gap of about 4 feet between the rooftops. I didn't think about the drop. I didn't think about the fact that I was a middle-aged architect who spent his days drafting HVAC ducts. I jumped. I landed hard on the gravel of the warehouse roof, the air leaving my lungs in a sharp wheeze. I rolled, clutching the box, and scrambled behind a rusted ventilation housing. I waited, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack them. Minutes passed. The sound of the rain was the only thing I could hear. No shouts, no boots. They were professionals. They wouldn't be screaming. They'd be hunting. I stayed there for an hour, shivering until my muscles cramped. When I finally dared to peek over the edge, the black sedan was gone. My apartment lights were still on, a square of yellow in the gray night, but the hallway window was dark. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't go back. I was a fugitive now, though for what I didn't know. I made my way down the warehouse's interior stairs, the air smelling of dry rot and stagnant water. I found a corner in the basement, hidden behind a stack of old shipping pallets, and collapsed. I was soaked, exhausted, and on the verge of a breakdown, but the box was still there. The rusted metal felt unnaturally warm against my legs. Now that the immediate threat of death had receded, Elena's words began to loop in my mind. They told me they'd kill you if I stayed. I found the proof. Do not trust the police. With trembling fingers, I reached for the latch. It was corroded, fused shut by years of moisture and neglect. I looked around the basement and found a discarded crowbar near a rusted boiler. I wedged the tip under the lid and leaned into it with all my weight. With a screech of protesting metal, the box popped open. I expected gold. I expected documents. I expected a confession. What I found was far more disturbing. Inside the box were 3 items. The first was a stack of photographs wrapped in plastic to protect them from the damp. I pulled them out and flipped through them. They were surveillance photos, hundreds of them, but they weren't of Elena. They were of me. Me at the office. Me at the grocery store. Me sitting on the park bench where Elena and I had our first date. They spanned years. Years before she disappeared and years after. Someone had been watching my entire life through a telephoto lens. The second item was a heavy gold signet ring. I picked it up, my blood turning to ice. I recognized it instantly. It belonged to Marcus Thorne, the senior partner at my old architectural firm, the man who had been like a father to me, the man who had suggested I leave the firm to protect its reputation. On the inside of the band, there was an inscription, "The foundation is everything." But it was the third item that broke me. It was a burner phone, its screen cracked but still functional. As I picked it up, the screen flickered to life. There was a single saved video file. My thumb hovered over the play button, my breath hitching in my throat. I pressed play. The video was grainy, shot from a hidden perspective in a dimly lit room. I saw Elena. She was tied to a chair, her face bruised, her copper hair matted with blood. She looked younger. This was from shortly after she disappeared. Standing over her was a man whose face remained off camera, but I recognized the voice. It was deep, calm, and terrifyingly familiar. "Where's the ledger, Elena?" the voice asked. "I don't have it," she rasped, a defiant glint still in her eyes. "Elias doesn't know anything. Leave him out of this." "Elias is the key," the man replied. "The Lakeshore Project wasn't just a building. It was a map. And if you don't give me what I want, I'll make sure he spends the rest of his life in a cell for your murder." The video cut to black. I sat in the dark, the silence of the warehouse pressing in on me. My entire life, the disappearance, the accusations, the ruin, it hadn't been a tragedy. It had been a play, a long, orchestrated performance designed to break me or to keep me in reserve for something. Suddenly, the burner phone in my hand began to vibrate. The screen lit up with an incoming call. There was no caller ID, just a string of zeros. My heart leapt into my throat. Elena? Was she calling to tell me she was safe? I slid the bar to answer and pressed the phone to my ear. "Elena," I whispered. There was a long pause. I could hear the sound of a car engine idling in the background. "Elias," a voice said. It wasn't Elena. It was the voice from the video, the voice of the man who had destroyed my life. "I see you found our little time capsule. I hope you enjoyed the trip down memory lane." "Who are you?" I screamed into the phone, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. "What did you do to her?" "What I did to her is nothing compared to what I'm about to do to you," the voice said, chillingly calm. "Look at the screen, Elias. I've sent you a little gift, a reminder of why you should have stayed in the shadows." A notification pinged. A new photo had been sent to the phone. With shaking hands, I opened the message. It was a photo taken less than a minute ago. It showed the warehouse I was currently hiding in, and in the foreground, standing right outside the basement door I had entered through, was a man holding a remote detonator. "Count to 10, Elias," the voice said, "and try to run faster this time." I didn't wait for 10. I didn't even wait for 4. The moment the voice on the phone stopped speaking, I lunged toward the far corner of the basement where a heavy iron slag door led to the old boiler room. I dove through the opening just as the world turned into a white-hot roar. The explosion didn't just break the silence, it erased it. A wall of overpressure slammed into my back, tossing me forward like a rag doll into a heap of rusted pipes and coal dust. For a long, terrifying minute, there was no sound, only a high-pitched whine that seemed to vibrate inside my skull. My vision was a blur of dancing gray spots. I coughed, my lungs screaming as I inhaled pulverized concrete and ancient soot. Above me, the warehouse groaned, the sound of structural steel twisting under the heat of the blast. I rolled onto my stomach, my hands frantically searching the floor. I didn't care about my wallet or my shoes. I needed the box. My fingers brushed against the cold, jagged edge of the metal. I pulled it to me, clutching it against my chest as I scrambled deeper into the dark. The boiler room was a labyrinth of shadows, but I knew these old Chicago buildings. They were built on top of even older structures, the city's forgotten layers. I found what I was looking for behind a stack of rotted wooden crates, a heavy steel grate set into the floor. It was a maintenance hatch for the old Chicago freight tunnels, a subterranean network that most people forgot existed. I didn't have a crowbar this time. I used my bare hands, the skin tearing on the rusted iron, until the grate gave way with a screech that was lost in the sound of the collapsing roof upstairs. I dropped into the dark, falling 5 feet onto a wet, narrow track. The air down here was stagnant, smelling of iron and deep earth dampness. I didn't have a flashlight, but the glow from the burning warehouse above filtered down through the hatch, illuminating the tunnel for a few yards. I ran. I didn't know which direction I was heading, only that I had to put distance between myself and the men with the red lasers. As I walked, the ringing in my ears began to subside, replaced by the rhythmic thud-thud of my own heart. I pulled the burner phone from the box. The screen was cracked further, but it still hummed with life. I looked at the surveillance photos again using the faint light of the screen. The realization hit me with the force of a second explosion. The photos of me weren't just random snapshots. They were timed. Each one had a timestamp and a set of GPS coordinates printed in tiny white text at the bottom. I looked at a photo of myself from 3 years ago, sitting in a diner. Then I looked at the coordinates. They weren't the coordinates of the diner. They were coordinates for the Lakeshore project. I was an architect. I knew those numbers by heart. 41.8981 degrees north, 87.6231 degrees west. The Lakeshore project was supposed to be my masterpiece, a 60-story residential spire with a glass facade that mimicked the ripples of Lake Michigan. But as I flipped through the photos, I saw that the map the voice had mentioned wasn't in the blueprints I had submitted. It was in the foundations. I remembered Marcus Thorne, my mentor, insisting on specific, unusual reinforcements for the sub-basement levels. He'd told me it was due to the unique soil composition near the water. I had trusted him. I had signed off on every load of concrete, every steel pylon, every storage vault that wasn't on the public permits. I wasn't just the architect of a building. I was the architect of a tomb or a fortress. The phone vibrated in my hand again. My heart stopped. It wasn't a call this time. It was a text message. The sub-basement, level 4, use the ring. It was from the same unknown number. But the tone was different. This didn't feel like the voice. This felt like a breadcrumb. I reached the end of the tunnel, where it intersected with a modern utility corridor. I followed the signs for Lakeshore Boulevard, my mind racing. If Elena was alive, if she had spent 5 years running, she wasn't just hiding, she was gathering ammunition. And she had brought it back to me because I was the only one who could get past the security I had inadvertently designed. 2 hours later, I emerged from a manhole 3 blocks away from the Lakeshore spire. The building was a shimmering needle of light against the midnight sky, a monument to the life I had lost. It was finished now, populated by the city's elite, oblivious to the secrets buried beneath their feet. I looked like a madman, covered in soot, blood, and rain, but I moved with a singular purpose. I skirted the main entrance, heading instead for the service-loading dock. I knew the patrol patterns of the night guards. I had written the security brief myself. I reached the elevator bank in the service hall. Most of the buttons went up to the penthouses, but there was a hidden panel behind the fire extinguisher cabinet. I slid it open, revealing a secondary keypad. I pulled the signet ring from the box. I looked at the "Foundation is Everything" inscription. I turned the ring over. There was a tiny, recessed notch on the side. I pressed my fingernail into it, and the face of the ring popped open like a locket. Inside wasn't a photo. It was a microchip, a physical bypass key. I inserted the ring into the slot beside the keypad. The elevator doors hissed open. There were no lights inside, just the cold blue glow of an auxiliary screen. I stepped in, and the doors closed, sealing me in silence. The elevator didn't go up, it dropped. Level 1, Level 2, Level 3. When it hit Level 4, the doors didn't open immediately. A voice echoed through the small cabin, not the distorted gravel of the man on the phone, but a recorded message in Marcus Thorne's smooth, Ivy League baritone. Identity confirmed. Welcome back, Elias. I always knew you'd be the one to finish the job. Elena simply didn't have the stomach for what comes next. The door slid back. I expected a concrete bunker. I expected a server room or a vault of cash. Instead, I stepped out into a luxurious, dimly lit office that was a perfect replica of my old office at the firm, down to the sketches on the wall and the half-empty bottle of scotch on the mahogany desk. Sitting in my chair, her back to me, was a woman with copper hair. "Elena?" I whispered, the box trembling in my hands. The chair slowly rotated. It was Elena, but she wasn't the broken, terrified woman who had stood in my hallway 2 hours ago. She was wearing a crisp, black suit. Her hair was perfectly styled. The scar on her face looked like a badge of honor, not a wound. And she was holding a silenced pistol pointed directly at my head. "You were always so predictable, Elias," she said, her voice cold and devoid of the love I had hallucinated earlier. "I told you not to trust the police. You should have realized that included me." Behind her, a wall of monitors flickered to life. Each screen showed a different angle of the city, but one screen was larger than the rest. It showed a live feed of my mother's house. 2 men in tactical gear were standing in her living room, their weapons raised. "Now," Elena said, her finger tightening on the trigger. "Give me the box, or I give the order." The air in the room was thick with the scent of ozone and the same expensive sandalwood cologne Marcus Thorne used to wear. I looked at Elena, the woman I had worshipped, the woman I had spent 5 years grieving, and I didn't see a victim. I saw a stranger wearing my wife's skin. "Why?" I managed to whisper, my voice cracking. 5 years, Elena. I lost everything. My career, my home, my sanity. I was a suspect in your murder. I lived in a hole while you were... What? Playing CEO in a basement? Elena didn't blink. The barrel of the silenced pistol remained perfectly level with my eyes. "I didn't choose this life at first, Elias, but I chose to survive it. When Thorne's people took me that night, they gave me a choice. I could die in a shallow grave, and they'd make sure you joined me within the week, or I could become an asset. I chose to save you. Everything I've done since then has been to keep that red dot off your chest. By pointing a gun at me now?" I shouted, my grief finally boiling over into rage. "By threatening my mother." I looked at the monitor. My mother was sitting in her favorite armchair, knitting a sweater, completely oblivious to the 2 masked men standing behind her sofa. One of them held a syringe. The other was checking his watch. "The box, Elias," Elena said, her voice dropping to a low, urgent hiss. "Give it to me, now. Thorne is on his way down. If he finds you here with it, there is nothing I can do to stop what happens next." "What's in it?" I asked, clutching the rusted metal tighter. "You said it was the proof. You said you came back to give me my life back." A flicker of something. Regret, perhaps? Or a lingering ghost of the woman she used to be, crossed her face. "It's a dead man's switch. The Lakeshore Project isn't just a building, Elias. It's a massive signal interceptor. Every piece of encrypted data that passes through this city is routed through the foundations of this spire. The box contains the master decryption keys. It's the only thing that can dismantle Thorne's empire. I told you that story in the hallway to get you to move, to get you to bring it here." "So you used me as a mule," I said, the realization cold and sharp in my gut. "You knew they'd chase me. You knew I'd be the only one who could get through the biometric locks because I'm the architect of record." "I did what I had to do," she snapped. "Now give me the box, or I swear to God I will watch them kill your mother on that screen." I looked from Elena to the monitor, then down at the rusted box. My mind, trained to see the structural integrity of buildings, was frantically searching for the structural integrity of this lie. If she really wanted the box to save me, why the gun? Why the threat? Then I saw it. On the mahogany desk next to her left hand was a small black device. It was a jammer, and beneath the desk, barely visible in the shadows, her foot was tapping a rhythmic, frantic code against the floor. SOS. She wasn't a villain. She was being watched. The office wasn't just a replica. It was a cage. The monitors showing my mother weren't just a threat to me. They were the leash Thorn used to keep Elena in line. She was performing for someone. I looked up at the ceiling, spotting the tiny pinhole camera lenses embedded in the crown molding. We weren't alone. "You want the box?" I said, my voice louder now, playing the part of the distraught, betrayed husband. "Fine, take it. But if you're going to kill me, look me in the eye when you do it." I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. Elena's hand trembled, the gun shaking almost imperceptibly. I reached out and slammed the box down on the desk between us. "Open it," I commanded. As she reached for the lid, I leaned in close, our faces inches apart. I could smell her shampoo, the same floral scent she'd used 5 years ago. It nearly broke my heart. "I know," I breathed, so softly it was barely a vibration of air. Her eyes widened, shimmering with unshed tears, but she didn't break character. She flipped the lid open, but instead of reaching for the photos or the ring, she lunged for the burner phone I had tucked into the corner of the box. At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors of the office swung open. Marcus Thorne stepped inside. He looked exactly as he had the day he'd fired me. Impeccably tailored charcoal suit, silver hair swept back, an expression of paternal disappointment. Behind him were the 3 men from my apartment, their tactical gear slick with rain. "A touching reunion," Thorne said, his voice echoing in the large room. "The architect and his muse. It's a shame it has to end in such a structural failure." "I have the keys, Marcus," Elena said, standing tall and sliding the burner phone into her pocket. "I did what you asked. Now let his mother go." Thorne smiled, a thin, cruel line. "In a moment, Elena. But first, I think Elias has something else for me. Something he doesn't even know he's carrying." He walked toward me, his presence filling the room with an oppressive weight. He didn't look at the box. He looked at the signet ring on my finger, the one I had used to enter the elevator. "You thought the ring was a key, didn't you, Elias? A way to get into my private sanctum." Thorne laughed softly. "The ring is a detonator. It's linked to the core stabilizers of this entire building. You didn't just walk into my office, you walked into a bomb. And as long as you're standing in this room, I have the power to level this spire and everyone in it." He turned to the lead tactical officer. "Check the box. Make sure the ledger is there." The man stepped forward and began rummaging through the box. He tossed the photos aside, ignored the gold ring, and pulled out a small leather-bound book, hidden in a false bottom I hadn't even noticed. "We have it, sir," the man said. "Good," Thorne said. He looked at me, then at Elena. "Now, about that deal. I promised to let your mother live, didn't I? Well, I'm a man of my word." He pulled a small remote from his pocket and pressed a button. On the monitor, the 2 men in my mother's living room turned and walked out the front door, leaving her unharmed. "There," Thorne said. "She's safe. For now." I felt a momentary surge of relief, but it was quickly eclipsed by a cold realization. Thorne wasn't finishing the job. He was starting a new one. "But you two," Thorne continued, his voice turning ice cold, "you know too much, and the world already thinks Elias killed his wife. It won't be hard to convince them he came here tonight, murdered his resurrected wife in a fit of madness, and then took his own life." He nodded to the tactical men. They raised their weapons. "Wait!" I screamed, holding up my hand with the signet ring. "You said this is the detonator. If you kill me and my heart stops, the signal breaks. If the signal breaks, the building goes down. You'll die, too." Thorne paused, his eyes narrowing. He looked at the ring, then back at me. A flicker of doubt crossed his face. "You're bluffing," he hissed. "You don't know the first thing about the secondary triggers." "I'm the one who designed the sub-basement, Marcus," I yelled, my heart racing. "I know the fail-safes better than you do. Try me. Pull the trigger and see if we all meet in hell in 10 seconds. The room went deathly silent. The tactical men looked at Thorne, waiting for the order. Elena was frozen, her hand hovering over the burner phone in her pocket. Suddenly, a loud, piercing alarm began to blare throughout the building. Red emergency lights bathed the room in a rhythmic, bloody glow. "What is that?" Thorne roared, turning to his men. "I didn't authorize a drill." "It's not a drill, Marcus," Elena said, her voice now filled with a terrifyingly calm triumph. She pulled the burner phone from her pocket and held it up. The screen was flashing a countdown. Elias didn't just bring the keys. He brought the virus. The moment he plugged that ring into the elevator, I uploaded the decryption sequence to the public cloud. Every secret, every lie, every piece of data you've stolen is being broadcast to the DOJ, the press, and the police right now. Thorne's face turned purple with rage. "Kill them! Kill them both!" But as the men moved to fire, the entire building gave a violent, sickening lurch. A massive explosion rocked the floor beneath us, not from my ring, but from somewhere deeper. The monitors showing my mother flickered and died. The lights cut out, plunging us into total darkness. In the chaos, I felt a hand grab mine. "Run," Elena's voice whispered in my ear. We scrambled through the dark, the sound of gunfire erupting behind us. We burst through the office doors and into the utility corridor, the building groaning like a dying beast. We reached the elevator bank, but the displays were dead. "The stairs!" I shouted. We tore down the concrete stairwell, flight after flight, the sound of the building's destruction chasing us. We reached the ground level, stumbling out into the loading dock just as the first sirens began to wail in the distance. The rain was still falling, washing the soot and blood from my face. I looked at Elena, the woman I had lost and found in the span of a nightmare. "We have to go," she said, pulling me toward a nondescript car parked in the shadows. "The police will be here in seconds, and Thorne's people won't be far behind." "Is it over?" I asked, gasping for air. "Did we win?" Elena opened the car door, but before she could get in, she stopped. She looked down at her chest. A small red laser dot was dancing on her white silk blouse. "Elias," she whispered, her face going pale. "Get in the car, now." Before I could move, a voice came over the car's external speakers, a voice that wasn't Thorne's. It was a woman's voice, crisp and clinical. "Mr. and Mrs. Thorne, you've done a wonderful job testing the security of the Foundation. Now it's time to come home." I looked at Elena. "Mrs. Thorne?" Elena didn't look at me. She looked at the shadows across the street, where a dozen more red dots were appearing on the pavement around us. "Elias," she said, her voice trembling, "there's something I never told you about who my father really was." The world didn't end with a bang or a whimper. It ended with a single word: Thorne. I looked at Elena, the red dot dancing across her heart like a terminal heartbeat. The rain lashed against the asphalt, the sirens in the distance sounding like the mourning cry of a city that had finally seen too much. "Elena?" I whispered. My voice felt like it was coming from a miles-long tunnel. What did she mean? Mrs. Thorne? Elena didn't look at me. She kept her eyes fixed on the shadows where the snipers were hidden. "My name isn't Elena Vance, Elias. It never was. It's Elena Thorne. Marcus. Marcus isn't just the man who ruined your life. He's my father." The ground felt like it was liquefying beneath my boots. Every memory of our 3 years of marriage, the shared coffee, the quiet mornings, the plans for a family, shattered. It was a mosaic of lies, a beautiful architectural facade designed to keep me in place. "You were an investment, Elias," she said, her voice trembling but cold. "The Foundation needed an architect who was brilliant, meticulous, and above all, controllable. My father found you, and he sent me to secure the asset. But I wasn't supposed to actually love you. That was the one variable they didn't account for." "Is that why you left?" I asked. "Because you loved me?" "I left because I found out what the Lakeshore Spire was really for," she said, finally turning to look at me. Her eyes were a storm of grief. "It wasn't just a signal interceptor. It's a node in a global surveillance network. My father wasn't just a crooked architect. He was a contractor for a shadow government. When I tried to stop him, He gave me a choice: disappear and let you live in disgrace, or stay and watch you be executed for a crime I'd frame you for. The woman's voice crackled over the speaker again, sharp and impatient. Enough of the melodrama, Elena. The data you uploaded is being intercepted as we speak. We own the servers. We own the press. We own the police. You've accomplished nothing but ensuring your husband's death is much more painful than it needed to be. Now step away from the car. She's right, Elias, Elena whispered. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small glass vial filled with a clear liquid. They're going to kill us, but they won't get what's in the foundations. I looked at the vial, then at the ring on my finger. Suddenly, the architecture of the entire conspiracy became clear to me. Thorne had said the ring was a detonator for the building, but I had designed those sub-basements. I knew the reinforcements weren't just for soil composition, they were for ventilation. The lakeshore spire wasn't just a building, it was a chimney. The master key, I said, my mind racing. The one in the box. It's not just for data, is it? Elena blinked, confused. It's a digital bypass, Elias. Why? Because Thorne was wrong, I said, a grim smile touching my lips. The ring isn't the detonator, I am. And I didn't design a bomb. I designed a vacuum. I grabbed the burner phone from her hand and typed in a series of commands I had memorized 5 years ago. The emergency override for the Spire's HVAC system. If the Spire is the node, I shouted toward the shadows, then the entire network is connected to the central cooling tower, and I just opened every gas valve in the sub-basement. Elena, give me the vial. She handed it to me without question. It was a highly flammable chemical accelerant, something the Foundation likely used for cleansing sites. You have 10 seconds to call off your dogs, I yelled at the speakers, or I send a spark through the ventilation shaft that will turn this entire block into a crater. You want the node? You'll have to sift through the ashes to find it. A long, agonizing silence followed. The red dots on Elena's chest flickered, then vanished. You're bluffing, Elias, the woman's voice said, though there was a tremor of uncertainty in it now. You're an architect. You don't have the stomach for mass destruction. I was an architect, I said, my voice hardening. Now I'm just a man who has nothing left to lose, and you should know better than anyone. You can't rebuild a life until you clear the site. I pressed the final enter key on the burner phone. A deep guttural hum began to vibrate through the pavement beneath our feet. The lakeshore spire 3 blocks away began to groan. Smoke, thick, black, and acrid, poured from the top of the glass needle. Go! I screamed at Elena. We dove into the car. She slammed the shifter into reverse, the tires screaming as we peeled away from the curb. Behind us, the street erupted, not in an explosion, but in a massive, localized implosion. The spire's internal structure, compromised by the gas-fed fire in the shafts, began to fold in on itself. The Foundation had built their empire on my blueprints. I simply erased the lines. We drove for hours, heading south, away from the city, away from the headlines that were already beginning to rewrite the story of the lakeshore disaster. Elena didn't say a word. She just kept her hands clamped on the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. As the sun began to rise over the flat, gray horizon of the Midwest, she finally pulled the car onto a dirt shoulder near a rusted farm fence. She turned the engine off. The silence was absolute. What now? I asked. My life was a ruin, my name was likely a ghost, and the woman sitting next to me was a stranger I had loved for half a decade. Elena reached out and took my hand. Her touch was cold, but her grip was firm. The Foundation is wounded, but they aren't dead. They'll spend the next year trying to cover this up. They'll say it was a gas leak. They'll say we died in the collapse. And did we? I asked. She looked at me, and for the first time since she'd walked back into my apartment, I saw a flicker of the woman I used to know. Elias Vance is dead, and Elena Thorne never existed. But there are other boxes, Elias, other buildings, other nodes my father built across the country. I spent 5 years learning where they are." She reached into the back seat and pulled out a worn, leather-bound notebook, the real ledger she had hidden before the tactical team arrived. "I came back for Atonement," she said softly, "but I think what I really need is an architect." I looked out at the rising sun. My life had been a landslide. I had been buried in the dirt for 5 years, breathing through a straw. But as I looked at the ledger and then at the woman who had both destroyed and saved me, I realized the weight was finally gone. I wasn't a suspect anymore. I wasn't a victim. I was the man who knew how the world was built, and I was going to be the man who knew how to tear it down. "Drive," I said. Elena shifted the car into gear, and we disappeared into the light of a new, uncertain day, leaving the ghosts of Chicago to burn in the rearview mirror. The hole in my life was still there, but for the first time in 5 years, I wasn't walking around it. I was building a bridge,